So today we are coming to the end of the boat stories. We've been spending quite a bit of time in these different stories of boats and people and things that are involved. And part of me wants to make a bad joke and say it's been smooth sailing all the way through. But if you've been paying attention to the stories, you know that it hasn't been. And in fact, today's story that we got the last part of the story from our scripture reading this morning is actually the story of a shipwreck. So it has not been cool and calm and nice and easy through all of this. And so the question is, why have we been looking at these stories? We've been looking at these stories, and the theme that we've been looking at as we go with them is this one that says, the seas of creation are brought forth under the control of the Son of Man, so that we can be renewed in life, faith, and hope for the future. And then with that renewal, we can go to every port and share the good news. We are reminded through the first stories of this series that Jesus is in control, even over the seas. Because how that works is, throughout human history, water has always been a sign of life. It has been a great power for destruction. And Jesus, throughout these stories, shows that he is the one that's in control of all of this, that he is the one who has command of these great powers. And so there is hope for us that through his teachings, we can be renewed in life, faith, and also in hope for the future. And it's why that renewal, beyond just being good for us in general, also gives us something we can do from that point going forward. That we can then go to every port and share that good news. And that's where we've been the last couple of weeks. We've been following Paul as he's been doing just that. He has been going, he has taken the teachings of Jesus and he has gone to all of the ports, gone to all of the places to share in that goodness, to share that gospel message. Paul will go on throughout his time in ministry, go on 4 journeys that takes him to many, many different places. Every time he stops at a new place. He'll meet new people and he'll share the gospel message in new ways. Each of those places is unique. They each have their strengths and things that give them new opportunities for being and for going out and meeting others and sharing that good news with others. But each of those places he stops also has their own unique set of struggles and things that they are trying to deal with. And so it's why that in so many of Paul's letters that we can't do this thing that we want to do with them, is that we read them in a Bible and they are all collected together and they're all nicely bound up and we sometimes have nice leather covers on those Bibles and maybe our names are stamped in them. And so we say, oh, these things are all together, so we've got to take these letters. And Paul must have had a clear, coherent theology through everything that he was saying. Paul would look at us and say, y'all are nuts. Because that wasn't what he was doing. Paul was guided by his faith. He found strength in his faith. But all those different points that are up there on the map that he stopped represent different folks. And so each letter he was writing was written to a specific people in a specific time, in a specific place. And so it's not that we can't learn anything from them, but it means that we have to be careful in our study to make sure that we're understanding more of what's going on so that we are then figuring out how does this work for us today, because we're very much in a different place than anywhere over in Asia Minor or in Greece or in Italy or anything like that. Paul had in his letters a calling to go and to spread the gospel. He was called to serve and to share his faith, just as we are each called to serve God, but to do so in different ways, because we're all different and unique. What ties us all together with all of our differences is our faith. And that is the piece that holds us together as a community, as a church. Even when everything else might be threatening to tear things apart, this is the thing that holds us together, is that faith. And we see that in Paul's story as we're coming now on his fourth journey, where things are literally trying to tear him apart on his boats and everything that he is doing in there. Paul is holding to that faith, and we'll see that it play itself out in truly some remarkable ways. But it took Paul a while to figure this whole faith thing out. Remember where it was he started. Last week we started his story. Remember, he was a Pharisee. And not just a Pharisee, but a Pharisee's Pharisee. He was the Pharisee that everyone else went to and said, hey, is this right? I mean, he was that guy. And he was one who was dead set against the teachings of Jesus, and he just was going to have none of it. But when he found faith, when he had his come to Jesus moment on the road to Damascus, he did that 180-degree turn, and then he was set, because he already knew everything that he needed to know. He was already well versed in all of Jesus' teachings. He just had to say, oh, those aren't wrong, those are right now, and they make a lot of sense, and he was able to go and to do. But the trouble was, he did things differently than everyone else did. And sometimes it would bring him, and not just sometimes, quite often, in fact, it would bring him into conflict with the other folks in the early church, especially Peter, but a number of other folks. He would be kind of at odds with them at different times. But that was good. And that worked out well, actually, because of what we read throughout the books of Acts is that those differences between them actually made them stronger, because they could hold each other accountable. Paul knew that he was accountable to the folks that were back in Jerusalem and to holding to the faith that he had received from them in so many ways, but also he was not afraid to hold Peter accountable and call him out on any number of occasions when Peter needed to be reminded of what was going on. And I think it's because of that, because of Paul's confrontation of Peter, that Peter was ready to see that things were going to be different. Because we get to Acts chapter 10. After this, that's after Paul had confronted Peter and said, Peter, dude, you're going to sit down with some folks over here and that'd be okay, but then when these folks show up, you're going to say, oh, no, I can't do that anymore? Paul said, you can't do that, man. And it began to work on Peter such that when we get to Acts 10, and Peter has this vision that God gives to him, where God is clear to Peter that, hey, the food laws that you have been working under have been superseded by the work of Christ. Peter was then in a position to really be able to see that and hear that, and ready to hear that, where maybe he wasn't before then. That was a good part of those differences coming out and working together. But then we really begin to see the power of Paul's faith. It comes in our scripture reading today, and this crazy story of Paul in a shipwreck. Now, Paul knew where he was going. I mean, not in the sense that he knew he was going to heaven, but in the sense that he knew at some point he was going to probably end up in Rome. So, he knew this part of the story was getting ready to happen, but it was going to be a long journey for him to get there. And so, Paul had faith that that's what was going on. It fit his calling. Look at all those places that Paul was called to go, all throughout what they knew of the world at the time. Paul had been to so many of those places, and you can't be a missionary called to go out to all the parts of the world and not go to the very center of that world and not go to Rome. And so Paul knew at some point he was going to get to Rome, but the question is, how did he get there? How did he ever find himself on that ship, on that journey to get there? Remember that Paul started out as a Pharisee. And then, so that when he converted and he came to faith in Jesus Christ, those other same Pharisees that he knew so very well didn't particularly care for him anymore in his change of faith. They knew what he was capable of. They knew how smart he was. They knew that him converting, that was going to be a powerful force that was going to be working against them, and they didn't like it. Now, they did what they always do in this situation, is they figure out some way to try and make the Romans do their dirty work. The Romans didn't particularly care at all, except they wanted one thing. They wanted to be able to maintain the peace in Judea, because that was something they struggled with, because the folks there were always just a little bit antsy to try and revolt at any given opportunity. And so they wanted to be able to maintain the peace, and the Pharisees knew that, and they used that to bring Paul up on charges. So they do that. They bring him up on charges, and how that works is he starts to move through all these different levels of bureaucracy as they're trying to work out what's going on and what's going to happen next. Now, I ran across this thought many years ago when I was reading a science fiction book, and it kind of has stuck with me over time. And it's this idea that At the lowest levels of a bureaucracy or of an institution or whatever, the person that is most important is the one who is coming in and bringing someone or something in to be looked at. Because if you are a level one person in a bureaucracy, and someone that's at level 10 walks in through your doors, who are you paying attention to, right? You're paying attention to that person because, man, they've got power, they've got authority, and you're going to do everything you need to make them happy because you don't want to get in trouble. Now, as he starts making his way up the list, once he gets to that level 10 sort of place, when everyone has power and authority, no one really cares about any of the power and authority you have. What they're looking at is who it is that he's bringing in with him. They become really curious about Paul. And Paul, who is a way better politician than any of those other folks, knew that, and he understood it. And he was more than happy to have conversations with Festus and with Agrippa and with others, and he could have conversations with them that no one else would have, because Paul's like, I'm already arrested, and if the Jews have their way, I'm going to die anyway. So what do I have to lose if I start calling these guys out or challenging their authority or doing any of these things? What's the worst thing that they're going to do? Well, not any worse than I'm already facing. And so he was able to have these great conversations, and those high-level leaders in Judea were like, man, this guy's smart. He's good. And we get what he's saying. They were beginning to be attracted to what he was saying, but those same leaders, those same religious leaders, were still pushing the issue. And Paul had one trump card left to play, but it was a big one. Because they kept wanting to do this, Paul knew that he wasn't going to get anywhere, because Agrippa and Festus and the others, they said, there's nothing wrong with him. There's nothing wrong with what he's doing. We don't see any problems in any of this. In fact, we kind of enjoy talking to him. The problem was, Paul knew they weren't ever going to leave him alone. So he plays that one last trump card that he has, and he says, I appeal to Caesar. Paul, being a Roman citizen, could do that. But when that happened, that set other wheels into motion. That meant if you're going to appeal to Caesar, you've got to be in Rome. And so they load Paul up on a ship with a bunch of other prisoners, with a Roman cohort, and all the sailors that it was going to take to get them to Rome, and they head off on this journey to go to Rome. Now, they were doing this, though, probably at the wrong time of year, because winter was beginning to come in. And they were setting off on this voyage. Now, what they did at the time was, the Romans in this time were not known for being great sailors. That just wasn't something that they were great at. And so their ships, they had a tendency, unless they absolutely had to, they'd go island hopping, and they'd try and stay close to shorelines as much as possible. And so they get out there, and then the storms start to come and start to rack this ship that they are all on. And at one point, towards the beginning of their journey, we don't know what prompted Paul to say this, but he tells them all, he says, when they had a decision to make, do we spend the winter on this island, or do we sail on to another island that the sailors like a whole lot better because there's a better port, better harbor for that? Paul said, no, we should really stay here at this one. Otherwise, if we don't, it's going to spell trouble for us. And, they're all looking at him going, Paul, you're crazy. You're a prisoner on a ship from this little place in Judea. What in the world do you know about sailing? We're going to listen to the sailors. We're going to go on to the next island to stay for the winter so the waters don't get bad. Paul says, all right, warned you. They go on, and of course the storms come up, and they start getting worried. And the storms start to get worse, and they start to toss cargo overboard to lighten the boat so they don't hit the sandbars. Remember, they're staying up close to the island, so that's going to be a worry that they're going to have. And one night, in the middle of this journey, Paul receives a vision from an angel that says, Paul, it's going to be okay. You're going to make it to Rome, and everyone that's on this ship with you is going to be safe and okay, and they're going to ride it through all these storms also. Paul, when reporting this to the other folks on the boat, said, we're going to be okay. The boat, not so much. It's going to be trouble. Now, remember, they still think he's crazy at this point. Like, what does he know? But at a certain point, even the crazy starts to make sense. Because the weather keeps getting worse. And at another point in this journey, there was a group of centurions that were part of the Roman cohort. They decide, we're done with this. We're going to jump in the lifeboat and we're going to go land someplace and ride the rest of this out. Paul sees this happening, looks over at the sailors and says, if they do this, we're all doomed. The sailors at this point are beginning to take Paul seriously, so they go cut the ropes to the lifeboat. It sets off on its own, and everyone is stuck now on the boat, on the ship. They are stuck now in the storm on a ship, and none of them know what's going to happen. Later on, Paul encourages them all to eat one last really good meal, to get really full. Before then, they toss all of their grain stores off of the side of the boat to keep it light so they don't run up on the sandbars. They cut off the anchors, they let go of the ropes to the rudders, and they raise the foresail because they've seen an island off in the distance, and they know that that's their last shot. They're just going to hope that they can run full speed into that island and run aground and they can be safe out there. That was a good idea, except all those sandbars they've been trying to avoid all this time, they run into one. Because, of course, that's what was going to happen. This is where we pick our story up for this morning. And this is the part where they get up there and the soldiers are like, well, we've run on this sandbar. The front part of the boat is a mess. It's not going anywhere anymore. And they're like, we can't have all these prisoners escaping. So let's just kill all the prisoners and we'll be good. One of the centurions says, Paul, we don't want to lose Paul. And so they say, that's a really bad idea. And so they tell everyone, jump overboard if you can swim, make for the island. If you can't swim, grab something to hold on to, and we just hope that you float over there. And they do it. By golly, it works. They get up the next morning, the storm is gone, it's done, and there is everyone on the island of Malta. They made it safely through the storm. Not the boat, but all of the people are safely on shore. Now, eventually Paul does make it to Rome. They spend a couple of months there on Malta. Paul has some more experiences where first he has to survive a snake bite, and then everyone thinking he's evil because of it. Then he performs a miracle and heals someone else, and then they finally get picked up. They make it to Rome. The rest of his journey is uneventful, and he gets to Rome, and they basically put him on house arrest. They say, you can go stay anywhere you want. We'll just put a guard outside your door. And he's then able to go and do whatever he wants. He even meets with the Jewish leaders that were in Rome, who knew nothing about him. You would think, because it was not a short trip from where they were to get to Rome, that maybe someone would send a message ahead saying, hey, this guy is coming, make sure the Romans deal with him the way we want. Then maybe they were just, their motives were a little bit sketchy back there to begin with. And so they had no idea who he was, and Paul says, all right, let me tell you who I am and what I'm doing. And he begins to preach and spread the gospel. We don't know much of what happened to Paul after that. The book of Acts ends telling us that Paul spent 2 years in Rome doing all of this work. And we have some traditions in terms of what happened, that eventually Paul is martyred in Rome, probably after the great fire in 64 that Nero blamed on the Romans, or on the Christians. And there's one tradition that says maybe he was martyred with Peter. But we don't know too much else of what was going on with that. The question is, why is this important? Why is Paul's boat story important? We can say it's because he had faith, but why is his faith important? His faith is important because the life of a religious leader normally doesn't end up involve getting shipwrecked on the Isle of Malta. I mean, so far I haven't, the closest I've been to Malta is Malta Bend, and I haven't been shipwrecked over there yet. So, I mean, we, that's not a normal thing that happens. Even back then, religious leaders expected their lives to be fairly predictable. That they knew what they were going to do, they knew how it was going to go. No good religious leader ever sets out to be a martyr. If you're following someone who is setting out to be a martyr, you might want to take a step back and not do that, because their motives are going to be a little bit suspect. That's just not what they wanted to do. But Paul knew what he was called to. He knew that he was called to go and to spread the gospel. He had faith in Jesus Christ, and he followed that calling, and he lived that calling out through all of those many journeys. He knew who he was, and he knew that he just had to do these things. And he was going to do it wherever it took him because that's what his faith was. And that's the thing that is important about Paul's story. Is that he held to his faith, he held to his calling. He was going to go and see, and he was going to see where that took him because that's who he was. The same is true for us as a church, as individuals, as a community. We all have a calling that God has placed on us. Probably not going to take us to all these places around here, although if there are a few familiar names from this part of the world that pop up in Missouri, so I mean we could reenact part of Paul's travels through that, but we don't often get called to go to these places, but we each do have a calling that God has put on us saying, I want you to go there. Take your faith and go and see what can come of it. We have the same as a church. That's what we've started this process of looking at and understanding what is our calling as a community of faith? What are we called to do here in our own community? What are the opportunities for ministry that we can be a part of that live out that calling, that show our faith in maybe a different way than we were expecting, but one that is important and good and can go and reach so many folks? We've got many opportunities ahead of us for that. One of which you'll get to hear next week. Emily and Jack and I won't be here. My little brother is getting married next weekend, so it's going to be a great celebration. But we're going to take a weekend off. And where did she go? They're like, where'd she go? But Jamie and her boss from Children's Division are going to be here to share a message with us and share opportunities that we have in front of us to help support many folks who are finding themselves in need, and so it's going to be that will be a good message, I know, and we have many others that are there, and so we're going to be spending the next few months kind of beginning to figure out what is God calling us to in this place and in this time, so that we can be the ones sharing that good news in our community. Let us be those folks that hear that call and go and do that work, and let us do this in Christ's name.